All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. I've been coming at you with a series of video presentations for the Rankin Technical College AWD Application and Web Development 1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class. The main text for this class is what you see on the screen, and that is ASP.NET MVC with Entity Framework and CSS by Lee Naylor. Before going through that book, I have decided to go through a series of the, not all, but many of the chapters in Professional ASP.NET MVC5 by John Galloway. I am in the middle of Chapter 8 on Ajax. And we are up to where it talks about here HTML5 attributes. So, it says if you look at the rendered markup for the action length that they talked about before, the one we just looked at, you'll find the following. The hallmark of unobtrusive JavaScript is not seeing any JavaScript whatsoever in the HTML. Now, you can run into problems with these dashed attributes. All right? Why? Because this works fine in CSS. This works fine in HTML, but typically in JavaScript, when JavaScript sees a dash like that, it thinks you're saying data minus Ajax. It thinks you're doing a mathematical operation. So quite often what it will do is it will replace that minus sign with an underscore. And if you don't know what I mean, you probably do, but just in case, what they're saying is, try that again. Instead of having something that looks like this, data dash Ajax equal true, you'll typically have data underscore Ajax equal true. All right, so this is more the JavaScript way as opposed to this way. All right, and they go into that a little bit in here. The purpose of the jQuery.unobtrusive-ajax file added is to look for specific data-attributes and manipulate them accordingly. It wants to make sure that things that should be able to communicate with one another indeed can communicate with one another. All right? All right, they go through a form example. I'm not going to. Let you look at that if you're interested on your own. The author says this is pretty much what ends up happening out of this. It shows an Ajax search form on the home page up here. Afterwards, they say, we'll return to this later on in the chapter to add additional features and functionality. All right. Client validation on page 233. Client validation for data annotation attributes is on by default with the MVC framework. We looked at this stuff earlier. Remember, for example, for our title field, it was required if we didn't put in a title, it came back and gave us that message. The string length for the title field had a maximum length in it of 160 characters. Here, if it was the price, if we left the price off, it came back with price as required. The price has to be between 1 cent and $100. All right. As it says, the data annotations make these properties required and put some restrictions in there. The model binder in ASP.NET MVC performs server-side validation. Client-side validation is done on the jQuery validation plugin. They mentioned earlier that the jQuery validation plugin, which is jQuery.validate, is in the scripts folder. If you want client-side validation, you'll need a reference to that basically in there, and that's how you put it in. So we've talked about this before, but let's say it again. All right, and that is, okay, I come in, I go into a website, and I want to order something. We used Dick's Sporting Goods before, so I go into Dick's. I want to order a basketball. All right. Well, I can't order 0 basketballs. That wouldn't make any sense. I can't order a negative number of basketballs. That wouldn't make any sense. They also may have some kind of a maximum. I can't come in there and order 10,000 basketballs. Let's say that at a time, you can only order 10 basketballs. All right. Well, you'd be able to, what you'd want to do first is you'd want to validate that on the client side. You wouldn't want to send a possible bad request over to the server. First, you'd want to validate everything that has to be validated on the client. And the author is saying that by default, this is done by using Jquery. You'll want to make sure that that reference script libraries is checked. So it says the easiest way to include that script is to make sure you select this when you scaffold a new controller. And you can add to the bottom of any view, you can put this in here. All right, 234, AJAX settings in web config. By default, unobtrusive JavaScript and client-side validation are enabled. However, you can change the procedure through your web config settings. It's the root level web config, so it's the one on the very bottom where you can turn things on and off. So that they're on by default. If you want, you could set them to false or off to turn them off. They mention here on the middle of page 235, the Jquery bundle references 2 scripts. The first is the Minified Jquery validation plugin, which implements all of the logic needed to hook events like submit and focus, or hook into those events, and execute client-side validation rules. The second one that's in there is a reference to Microsoft's unobtrusive adapter for Jquery validation. As mentioned here, the code inside of this script is responsible for taking the client-side metadata the MVC framework emits and adapting or transforming it into data that the Jquery validation understands. So it's making sure that our ASP.NET C# MVC code can indeed communicate with Jquery. Custom validation here on page 236. And what the author does is, you may or may not remember, but back in Chapter 6, we talked about and wrote a script to validate the number of words in a string. And I think that the number of words had a maximum of 10 in it. So it looked pretty much like this. The author says this could basically, says you can use that attribute as follows in here. So max words 10, which is going to basically call this. All right. But this can virtually be rewritten using Jquery as well. Now, one of the things that it uses to do this is what's called the iClient validate interface. And interface, for lack of better words, what an interface actually is it's when you work with classes in a programming language like C# or like Java, for example, they only allow single inheritance. So when you create a new class, it can only inherit from one parent. All right. But if you have an interface, which basically just has the name of empty methods in it, and it could have constants in it too. All right. But then you need an interface. So you inherit classes, you implement interfaces. You can inherit 0 or 1 classes. You can implement 0, 1, or more interfaces. And they describe how to do this on page 237. And see the code down toward the bottom of the page. All right. If you think about the scenario, there are a few pieces of information you would need on the client to run the validation. Number 1, what error message to display if the validation fails. Number 2, how many words are allowed. Number 3, an identifier for a piece of JavaScript code that you can use to count the words. And they show you that here. Fortunately, on the bottom of 238 and going on to 239, the author says you do not have to write any code that digs out metadata values from data-attributes on the client. However, you will need 2 pieces of script in place for validation to work. The adapter, which works with unobtrusive MVC extensions to identify the required metadata, and the validation rule, also known as a validator itself. So the validation rule is what you say, what can or what cannot happen. All right? What you will, won't allow, whatever. We talked a little bit earlier about the adapter. Okay, it says the MVC framework's unobtrusive validation extension stores all adapters in jQuery.validator.unobtrusive.adapters object. Here are the adapter methods. So they go through and they run this. And you get this again. These are designed to be words that you have in the title. Remember we said earlier that the maximum number of words you can have in there are 10. Well, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So it spits that back. And they mention after this, if we want to see this, we could bring up the store manager create. I'm not going to. Although the ASP.NET MVC Ajax helpers provide a great deal of functionality, there is an entire ecosystem of extensions that go much further. And that's explained in the next section, which is called Beyond Helpers. All right, I'm a little early, but I am going to stop right here and pick up that next section in the next lecture. So I will be back with that shortly.